Less than 24 hours after her husband died, the city fined her for grieving. But what the judge did next left the entire courtroom in tears. Good morning. Please be seated. Most people walk into a courtroom and they only see the heavy wooden bench, the wooden gavel, and the thick books of municipal statutes. They think justice is simply a cold, unforgiving math equation. You break a rule, you pay a fine, the city collects its money, and the scale magically balances. But after decades of sitting in this exact chair in Providence, I have learned a professed truth. The law is a terribly blunt instrument if you do not wield it with a human heart. Sometimes the paper in a file tells a straightforward story of carelessness or negligence, but other times, if you are willing to look closely enough, that same stack of paper is screaming a story of unbearable heartbreak. You just have to be willing to look past the black ink. It was a cold Tuesday morning. The courtroom was packed, the air thick, with the usual quiet anxiety of everyday people waiting to see how much their daily mistakes were going to cost them. The radiators were hissing, fighting off the bitter New England winter outside. We had already cleared the routine matters of the docket, the expired meters, the minor speeding tickets, the confused college students. Then my clerk handed me a file that made me stop and adjust my glasses. The total amount owed jumped off the page, exactly $2,000. It wasn't for a major criminal offense, a DUI or a hit and run. It was a rapid accumulation of overnight parking tickets, heavily bloated by months and months of ignored late fees, collection penalties, and administrative charges. A number like that can absolutely ruin a working-class person. The case was City of Providence versus Margaret Collins. I called her name, preparing myself for the interaction. When a city bill gets that high, you usually expect someone who has been actively dodging the system, someone angry at the government, or someone who treats parking enforcement like a joke. But the woman who slowly walked up to the podium shattered that assumption in a single instant. She was perhaps in her late 60s, wearing a faded black wool coat that looked at least a size too big for her fragile, shrinking frame. She moved with a specific kind of slowness that did not come from age, but from a profound, invisible weight pressing down on her shoulders. She clutched a thick, highly disorganized folder of papers to her chest as if it were a shield protecting her from the world. Her eyes were completely hollow, deeply rimmed with red, and she looked up at the bench, not with defiance but with absolute crushing surrender. This was not the look of a scofflaw trying to beat the system. This was the look of a human being who was quietly drowning in plain sight, and the court was just another wave crashing over her head. I looked down at the prosecutor's list, and it was a relentless litany of citations. Overnight parking, no permit, expired meter, blocking a street sweeping zone over and over, day after day, week after week. The fines had multiplied like a virus. The original tickets were mostly $30 or $40, but the late penalties, the ignored notices, and the collection fees had compounded them into a massive mountain of debt. "Ma'am," I began gently, leaning forward slightly on the bench, "the city says you owe $2,000 for parking violations spanning a period of roughly 3 months last winter. Can you tell me what was happening?" She approached the microphone slowly. Her hands were visibly trembling as she frantically adjusted the disorganized papers in her folder. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, dry and fragile, sounding like autumn leaves scraping across the pavement. "I know, Your Honor. I know they are my tickets. I couldn't move the car. I'm so sorry. I didn't have the money to pay them back then, and I definitely don't have it now." She didn't offer an elaborate excuse. She didn't complain about the parking authority being unfair or claim that the meters were broken. She just stood there and accepted the crushing weight of it all. But that is exactly when a judge has to stop being a rubber stamp for the city's revenue department and start being an investigator of the human condition. I looked much closer at the timeline and the geography of the citations. There was a distinct pattern. I noticed that almost every single one of these tickets was issued on the exact same block on a very specific street on the east side of the city. It wasn't near a shopping mall, and it wasn't near a nightclub or a restaurant. It was the street directly adjacent to the palliative care wing of Providence Hope Hospital. "Mrs. Collins," I said, softening my tone even more, trying to reach through the barrier of her fear, "I am looking at the locations of these tickets. You were parked on the same block day and night for almost 90 consecutive days. Were you working at the hospital?" She slowly shook her head, a single tear finally breaking free and tracing a line down her weathered cheek. "No, Your Honor," she replied, her voice breaking into a sob. "My husband Edward, he was on the oncology ward. He was dying." The nurses told me it could happen at any moment. I couldn't leave him alone. I just couldn't leave his bedside to go down and feed a parking meter." When she said those words, a heavy absolute silence fell over the courtroom. You could hear the rain tapping against the glass windows. The people sitting in the gallery, who had been whispering about their own minor traffic tickets just moments before, were completely still. When you sit on this bench for as many years as I have, you hear every excuse in the book. People tell you they parked illegally because they were late for a haircut or because they couldn't find a spot near their favorite coffee shop. But this was not an excuse. This was a profound human tragedy. I looked at this frail woman, a devoted wife, who had spent the last 3 months of her husband's life watching him fade away in a sterile hospital room, and I realized something truly heartbreaking. While she was inside holding his dying hand, the city was outside systematically placing pieces of paper under her windshield wiper. She looked down at the wooden podium, her voice barely holding together. "Your Honor, there was one afternoon I went down to the street to feed the meter. I was gone for maybe 20 minutes. While I was gone, his breathing became very shallow and the medical alarms went off. When I finally got back to the room, he was terrified. He thought I had left him to die alone. I held his hand, and I made a promise to him right then and there. I told him, 'Edward, I am not leaving this room again until we go home or until God calls you.' So I stayed. I slept in the hard plastic chair next to his bed. I knew the tickets were piling up out there in the snow, but how could I care? How could a parking meter matter more than my husband's final moments? How indeed? The city sees a car occupying a space for too long and it simply registers an offense. A computer automatically generates a late fee after 30 days. A collection agency adds a massive penalty after 60 days. The system is entirely blind. It does not know that the registered owner of that vehicle is busy making funeral arrangements. It does not know that the threatening letters demanding payment are piling up on a kitchen table in a house that now feels unbearably empty. "Mrs. Collins," I said softly, giving her a moment to catch her breath. "Did you bring any documentation with you today?" She nodded slowly and opened the battered folder she had been clutching to her chest. Her hands shook violently as she pulled out a single heavy piece of paper with a raised state seal. She handed it to the bailiff, who walked it up to the bench. I adjusted my glasses and looked down at the document. It was her husband's death certificate. I looked at the official date of his passing. Then I looked back at the long computerized print out of the parking tickets the city was demanding she pay. I held the death certificate in my hand. It is a profound document, a piece of paper that legally declares the end of an entire universe for the people left behind. I read the date of passing, February 14th, Valentine's Day. A day meant for celebrating love, and instead it was the day she had to say a final goodbye to the man she had loved for over 40 years. Then I cross-referenced that tragic date with the computerized printout provided by the city parking authority. The dates lined up in a way that made my stomach turn. The final parking ticket, the specific citation that triggered the massive cascade of extreme late fees and collection penalties, was issued at 8:45 a.m. on February 15th. Think about that for a moment. Less than 24 hours after her husband drew his final breath, while this grieving widow was likely sitting in a funeral home trying to pick out a casket, while she was making the hardest phone calls of her entire life to tell her children their father was gone, a parking enforcement officer was placing a neon envelope under her windshield wiper. And when she didn't pay that ticket within 30 days because she was busy planning a burial, mourning her profound loss, and trying to figure out how to simply breathe in a house that suddenly felt entirely too large and too quiet, the automated system punished her with a $200 late fee. "Mrs. Collins," I said, my voice dropping to a low, quiet register. The microphone amplified the absolute stillness in the room. "I am looking at these dates. The city charged you the maximum penalty because you missed the 30-day payment window for a ticket issued the morning after your husband passed away. They effectively fined you for grieving." She nodded, her shoulders shaking as she wiped her eyes with a crumpled tissue. "I didn't even see the ticket for weeks, Your Honor. The car just sat there on the street near the hospital. I didn't drive it. I took a taxi home the day he passed. I couldn't even bring myself to go outside. When I finally found all those envelopes, I called the parking authority. I tried to explain. I told the person on the phone that my husband had just died." She paused, struggling to get the words out. They told me that bereavement is not a valid legal excuse for an outstanding parking violation. That is the exact moment when the law stops being justice and starts being cruelty." I looked past her. scanning the gallery of the courtroom. I saw a young man in the back row wipe his eyes. I saw a police officer standing near the door, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. The system had utterly failed this woman. It had treated her profound human suffering as nothing more than a clerical error, a missed deadline on a spreadsheet. Bereavement is not a valid legal excuse. I repeated those words slowly, letting them hang in the heavy, silent air of the courtroom. I looked down from the bench at Mrs. Collins. She was clutching her hands together so tightly her knuckles were completely white, as if she was bracing herself for me to agree with the voice on the phone. She was standing there shivering slightly in her oversized coat, waiting for the final blow to fall. But I felt a profound quiet anger rising in my chest, not at her but at a system that had become so incredibly automated, so obsessed with revenue and rigid compliance that it had completely lost its soul. "Let me tell you something about the law, Mrs. Collins," I said, leaning forward and looking directly into her hollow, tear-filled eyes. "The people who write the municipal parking statutes and program the collection computers do not sit where I sit. A computer cannot look you in the eye. A computer does not know what it feels like to hold the hand of the person you have loved for 40 years and watch them take their very last breath. It only knows numbers, dates, and 30-day deadlines. But a judge is not a computer. A courtroom is not a calculator. The law was created by human beings to serve human beings. And when the strict blind application of that law causes a profound injustice, it is my duty, it is my absolute moral obligation to intervene." I picked up the thick, intimidating file of tickets. It felt absurdly heavy in my hands, a physical manifestation of bureaucratic cruelty. "The city wants $2,000 from you. They want you to empty what little savings you might have left. Money you desperately need right now for funeral expenses, winter heating bills, and groceries simply because you chose love over a parking meter. They want to aggressively penalize you for being a devoted wife in the absolute darkest hour of your entire life." I slowly shook my head and tossed the thick folder onto my desk. It landed with a dull, dismissive thud. "If I were to uphold these fines today, if I were to demand that you pay this city $2,000 for the so-called crime of refusing to let your husband die alone in a hospital room, I would not be serving justice. I would be participating in an act of institutional cruelty against a grieving widow, and I will not do that." "Mrs. Collins," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room, "every single one of these citations, every late fee, every collection penalty, they are all hereby completely dismissed." I brought the wooden gavel down. It wasn't a loud punitive strike. It was a firm, quiet punctuation mark ending her nightmare with the city. At the sound of the gavel, her knees seemed to give out. She gripped the edges of the wooden podium just to keep from falling. The disorganized stack of papers she had been clutching so tightly finally slipped from her trembling hand, scattering across the courtroom floor. But she didn't even try to pick them up. She just buried her face in her hands and wept. It wasn't a gentle, polite crying. It was the deep, soul-shaking sobbing of a woman who had been holding her breath for months and was finally allowed to exhale. I waited for a moment, giving her the time she needed to process the relief. My wife stepped forward and quietly gathered her scattered papers, placing them gently back on the podium. But as I watched her cry, I knew my job wasn't completely finished. I had erased her legal debt, but I hadn't erased her grief, and I certainly hadn't solved the reality of the empty house she was about to return to. "Margaret," I said gently, deliberately dropping the formal Mrs. Collins. She slowly looked up, her face wet with tears, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "The city's debt is gone, but I need to ask you a much more important question now. How are you surviving right now? Who is taking care of you?" She wiped her eyes with a frayed sleeve of her oversized coat. "I'm entirely alone, Your Honor," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "We didn't have any children. Edward's illness and the funeral wiped out whatever small savings we had left. I live on a very strict fixed income, and I've been so absolutely terrified of these tickets that I've barely been sleeping or eating. I was actually skipping meals, just trying to save enough quarters and dollar bills in a jar to offer you a payment plan today. I just didn't want the city to take my car or send me to jail. Hearing that a grieving widow was literally starving herself to pay a heartless municipal penalty broke my heart all over again." "Margaret, you are never ever going to jail," I assured her firmly. "But you cannot stop taking care of yourself. Edward would not want that. He held on to you in those final moments because you were his ultimate comfort. But now you have to find a way to comfort yourself." I reached into the drawer under my desk. "In this court, we are blessed to have a small philanthropic fund a fund fueled by the incredible generosity of people all over the world who want to help individuals facing extraordinary hardship. I pulled out a white envelope, preparing to make sure her justice came with a side of actual grace. I held the plain white envelope in my hand. In my years on the bench, I have seen this small fund perform absolute miracles. It is sustained by the pure kindness of strangers. People watching these proceedings from across the country and around the world who send in $5 here, $10 there, simply because they want to help someone they have never even met. I looked down at Margaret, who was still trembling, wiping her endless tears with her worn, frayed sleeves. "Margaret," I said, leaning closer to the microphone so she could hear every single word clearly. "This envelope does not contain city money. It contains the compassion of ordinary people who understand what it means to struggle and what it means to grieve. There's $500 in here." Her eyes went wide, and she immediately shook her head, holding up her frail hands as if to physically push the money away. "Oh, no, Your Honor, I couldn't possibly. I didn't come here for charity. I just came to try and explain what happened with the car." "I know you didn't," I replied gently but firmly, "but you are not leaving this courtroom empty-handed. As a municipal judge, I have the authority to dismiss your legal debts. But as a human being, I cannot in good conscience send you back out into the freezing winter, knowing you have been starving yourself to pay a government that failed to show you an ounce of mercy. So, I am giving you a direct judicial order." I managed a soft smile, hoping to break the incredibly heavy tension in the room. "You are going to take this envelope. You are going to go straight to the grocery store and you are going to buy the ingredients for a proper warm dinner. Then you are going to go home and turn up the heat in your house so you aren't shivering. And whatever is left over you use to keep your lights on. Do you understand my order, Margaret?" She looked at the envelope as my baff gently walked it over and placed it directly into her hands. Her trembling fingers traced the edges of the paper, and she looked back up at the bench with a profound expression of disbelief. "Why?" she whispered, her voice completely cracking. "Why are you doing this for me?" "Because you are not invisible," I told her, my own voice thick with emotion. "For 3 months, the system treated you like a nuisance illegally occupying a parking space. Today, this court is treating you like a human being who has suffered a tremendous loss. You loved your husband completely and you honored your vows to him until the very end. That is something to be respected, not penalized." As she clutched the envelope to her chest, something incredibly beautiful happened. A woman sitting in the front row of the gallery stood up. She didn't ask for permission to speak. She simply walked up to the wooden barrier, reached into her purse, and placed a folded $20 bill on the podium next to Margaret. Then a young man in the back row stood up, walked forward, and placed a $50 bill right next to it. They didn't say a single word. They just wanted this grieving widow to know that she was no longer sitting in that hospital room alone. I watched as more people stepped forward. It started with just the two of them, but soon a quiet line formed in the center aisle of my courtroom. A college student dropped a handful of crinkled $5 bills. A mechanic in a grease-stained shirt handed her a 50. Even the city prosecutor, the very person whose job it was to represent the government's financial interest, quietly walked over and placed a folded bill into her trembling hand. In less than 3 minutes, the wooden podium, where people usually stood to defend their traffic mistakes, had been completely transformed into an altar of profound human kindness. Margaret stood in the center of it all, her frail shoulders shaking, no longer sobbing out of fear, but weeping from the sheer overwhelming weight of unexpected grace. She looked up at the bench, her hands overflowing, and simply mouthed the words, "Thank you." "You are very welcome, Margaret," I replied, my own voice betraying the emotion I was trying so hard to keep in check. "Now you take that and you go take care of yourself. Court is adjourned for a 10-minute recess." As I watched her slowly walk down the center aisle, surrounded by the profound respect of every single person in that room, I sat back in my leather chair and took a deep breath. People often ask me if dealing with traffic tickets and municipal violations every single day gets tedious. They think it is just a repetitive, endless cycle of fines, excuses, and paperwork. But moments like this remind me exactly why I still put on this black robe. If I had simply done what the computer dictated, if I had blindly followed the rigid black and white letter of the municipal code, I would have sent a grieving, starving widow out into the freezing snow with a debt that would have completely destroyed her life. I might have been legally correct, but I would have been morally bankrupt. We build our legal systems with the intention of maintaining order, but order without empathy is just another form of tyranny. The law is meant to protect the fabric of our society. But you cannot protect a society if you are willing to crush the most vulnerable people living inside of it. When a judge stops to ask why, when we take the time to look past the citations, past the late fees, and past the cold automated spreadsheets, justice actually has a fighting chance. Margaret Collins walked into that courtroom carrying the unbearable weight of her husband's death and the cruel punishment of a blind bureaucracy. But she walked out carrying the profound reminder that even in the darkest, most terrifying chapters of our lives, humanity can still show up. And when the law is truly wise, it knows exactly when to put down the gavel and when to extend a helping